Welcome, on behalf of the Arts Society of North Wiltshire, to our first in a series of short talks, which we're going to be calling Moments with a Masterpiece. What we're going to do is to take one picture and look at it in detail. And in many ways, that's so different to what we normally see in a gallery these days. There you often see people spending more time reading captions or taking photographs of captions or photographs of the picture than actually looking and studying the picture in the detail that it deserves. So the picture we're going to look at today is Benozzo Gozzoli's Journey of the Magi. Journey is quite difficult to show because it actually covers three walls of the Medici chapel in the Palazzo Medici in Florence. And here we can see a montage of it. I'm going to be looking at it in more detail soon, but I really hope that you can see immediately how splendid it is, how colourful it is, how vibrant it is. It's the kind of picture that Cecil B. DeMille himself would have been proud of. You would have had Charlton Heston and Burt Lancaster featuring as two of the kings. And you'd probably have Leonardo DiCaprio, somebody like that as the young king. But what you wouldn't have is Elizabeth Taylor. Because one of the surprising things about this picture is that there are no women in it anywhere. So before we look at the picture, let's just say a few words about Benozzo himself. He was born in 1420, 1421 in the countryside outside of Florence, and he was the son of a tailor. And that's really important, as we'll come to understand later. Benozzo was a central figure in the early Italian Renaissance. He left behind him more than 145 known works. He worked on some of the most important commissions of the 15th century. And his journey universally agreed to be one of the most glorious and sumptuous works of that period. It was done for one of the most prestigious palaces in Florence, a palace that was owned by the wealthiest and most famous family in Florence. And yet, even today, few people have heard of him. And if they have heard of him, he's probably best known as the painter of Christmas card angels. And indeed, he was a master of painting that. But when we look in more detail at the journey, you'll soon see how much greater his skill is than that and what a masterpiece he produced in the journey. It's not surprising, really, that he was a master of painting angels because his early formative years were spent working alongside Fra Angelico. And this was an experience that was critically important to his future. He worked with Fra Angelico on the decoration of the convent in St. Marco in Florence. And there he had the honor to paint Cosimo de' Medici's cell. It was Benozzo's first adoration, and you can see here that it was a traditional representation of the story. The three kings are making their way to celebrate the birth of the baby Jesus against a very stylized and traditional mountain backdrop. Benozzo first signed himself as a painter in 1444 when he signed a 3-year contract to work alongside Lorenzo Ghiberti on the east doors of the baptistry in Florence. Those doors, as everyone will know who's visited Florence, are a magnificent example of goldsmith's work. And Benozzo here proved himself to be a very skilled goldsmith. He could work in incredibly fine detail. And when you see the modeling of the drapery in this detail of Solomon and Sheba, you can see immediate the influence of his father's skills as a draper. So the painting is in the private chapel of this palace, the Palazzo Medici in Florence. It was described by Cosimo as a comfortable dwelling, but Pope Pius II more accurately described it as a palace fit for a king. Very important to recognize that it was the first palace to be given permission by the Pope to house a private chapel, and it was a very intimate private chapel. The subject chosen was the story of the Magi, and here you can see a procession which is typical of the processions that are still held in Florence to this day to celebrate the story of the Magi on the 6th of January, Epiphany. It's still a national holiday in Italy. The Medici were patrons of the Florentine fraternity, the Compagnia de' Magi. Cosimo took part in the annual processions, and on one occasion, 700 horses, 700 horses were involved in the procession. Can you imagine what a incredible spectacle that must have been? And just take a look for a moment at the man in green on the horseback on the right, because you can see in modern day Florence the same costume that they wore in the journey of the Magi 500 years earlier. So each wall was devoted to one of the three kings. It's largely painted in traditional fresco using ground pigments applied to wet plaster. The whole work was completed in around 150 days with no major reworking. That's incredible speed and talent, considering that there are portraits everywhere, and the work itself is considered to be one of the greatest landscape paintings of the 15th century. We're going to look at those walls and the painting in more detail in a moment, but I do think we should spend a few moments just looking at the influences on Benozzo. It's Benozzo's masterpiece, but his patron, Piero de' Medici, had a major influence on it. First, he would have given Benozzo a very simple message, and it's to do with this painting by Gentile da Fabriano. The message was simple. I want you to outdo our rivals, the Strozzi. They'd been the wealthiest bankers in Florence until they were exiled by the Medici in 1434. They commissioned the adoration for their private chapel in the Church of Santa Trinita in Florence in 1423. And the work is universally recognized to be a culmination of the international Gothic style. Incredible surface decoration, lavish gold leaf, amazing frames and jewels. It's a wonderful, wonderful picture. But the second thing that the patron would have said is, I don't want us to be seen to be stuck in the past in the style of international Gothic. If you like, we're the new kids on the block, and we want to show that we're on trend. We want to embrace the latest fashion. And the latest fashion you can see here in this Devonshire hunting tapestry, because the passion was for collecting Franco-Flemish tapestries. And you can see very clearly how these tapestries really had a strong influence on Benozzo. If you're lucky enough to come face to face with a painting in the chapel, you're immediately enveloped in a magical world of courtly grandeur. And as you enter the chapel, well, it's an intimate religious space, so you might expect a religious statement of faith with the baby Jesus at the center. But this is not the adoration in which the Medici will be bowing down before the spiritual power of the church. This is the journey. And the name is significant because in this picture, the Medici would not be bowing down before anybody. What it's about is temporal power, a world in which wealth reigns supreme. And it's no doubt that you're in the presence not just of wealthy bankers, but people who want to show themselves because they believe they're going to become the dynastic rulers with a God-given right to reign in Florence. At this moment in time, they may not be princes by birth, but this picture is a symbol of their aspiration. It's a symbol of the journey of the Medici towards becoming the equals of the great and good of Italy. What you see in this detail is the surface decoration in which the most expensive pigments and gold leaf are used in profusion. And just look for a moment at those magnificent costumes. People have written PhDs based on this work, explaining costume design in the 15th century. Maybe actually the Magi are not on the way to Bethlehem, because for me, it actually looks more like they're on the catwalk in Milan. So, final step before we look at the journey in detail is just to pause for a moment and admire this work by Fra Filippo Lippi. This is the adoration, and it's this adoration which is the religious work at the heart of the chapel. This is the painting that the Medici family would worship before. So, central to the picture, we have three kings representing the three generations of the Magi. We have Lorenzo, soon to become Lorenzo the Magnificent. We have Piero, and we have Cosimo, the founder of the dynasty. But these are not portraits, they're symbols, and there's symbolism everywhere in this picture. For example, we see the young king in the morning sun. We see the middle king in the noonday sun. And we see Cosimo in the setting sun. White, green, and red. Do you ever wonder when you look at a picture why those colours were chosen? Well, there are two reasons here. First of all, they're the colours of the three virtues, faith, hope, and charity. But perhaps more importantly, there are also the symbolic colours of Florence. Those of you who've seen the Duomo in Florence will know that the facade is coloured white, green, and red. And the Medici here are saying, we are Florence, and that message would have been readily understood by Florentines of the time. So let's look in detail now at the three walls, and with the east wall, on which much of the action takes place, you can play the favourite game, if you like, of art historians, which is spot the celebrity. We've got the young king in the centre, historically considered to be Lorenzo himself, but actually he was only 10 at the time, so it's not him. But Lorenzo does feature in the picture, but he does so in the crowd scene. And what you have here are the great and the good of Florence all crowded together, all in prominent positions, all vying for space, and all immediately recognized to other Florentines because these are real, not stylized portraits. Central to the picture is Piero, the patron of the picture, seated on his majestic white horse. Actually, his other name is Piero the Gouty, and it probably would have had difficulty getting on a stallion of that size. Piero, as a patron, actually micromanaged the project. So there's a wonderful piece of correspondence where his manager writes to Benozzo to say he's really displeased by one of the angels. It's just not good enough. Benozzo writes back and says, "Oh, forgive me, I totally agree with you. I'll redo it. Nay, I'll actually cover it with a cloud." And there are a number of clouds in this picture. So riding next to Piero is Cosimo on a humble donkey. And at first glance, he looks humbly dressed in black. But on closer inspection, that black is actually black satin velvet trimmed with sable. In private, the Medici would certainly flaunt their wealth, but in public, Cosimo went round Florence on a donkey. Bankers were viewed by the church as usurers. It was important, therefore, to be seen in public as pious and humble. Patronage of the arts and investment in the church was a way of showing their Christian devotion and a way of offsetting their sin of usury. For them, it would ease their path to salvation. Cosimo might be humble, but Benozzo was certainly not. He painted himself into the picture not once, but twice. And just in case you were any doubt about who he is, he puts his name on his hat. So let's move on to the south wall and the middle king. And here we have a king almost arranged in a stage set because it's pure theatre. Despite the mass of people around in the picture, there's an enormous stillness about it. What we have is a proud figure mounted on a magnificent stallion set against a background of a majestic Tuscan landscape. And if we zoom in for a moment and look in more detail at the middle king, just look at these fabrics. We said already that Benozzo was a son of a tailor, and here he demonstrated it par excellence. An American art historian has suggested actually that the chapel was a shop window for the Medici. They were cloth manufacturers and merchants, and they wanted to show off their wares. I think that's going a bit far. But it's certainly true that Benozzo was told which fabrics to include, and those fabrics belonged to the Medici. And it's certainly true that they wanted to showcase the opulence of the design. And so Benozzo here plays tricks on us. He doesn't show the folds of the drapery. What he shows instead is the fabric being stretched across the drapery so as not to distort the gilding. And then the beautiful pattern here is made deliberately over scale, so it really commands our attention. The oldest king on the west wall is considered to be the Patriarch of Constantinople, or the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Medici were not averse to a bit of flattery. He leads the procession, and he's closest to reaching Bethlehem. Before him, there's a page in blue with a leopard on his horse. He's the Duke of Lucca. Do you ever ask yourself when you look at a painting why something's there? In this case, what's a leopard doing on the back of a horse? Well, it's Benozzo having a joke with us. The leopard is the emblem of the house of Lucca. So Benozzo's having a bit of fun with them. The focus on the west wall, and indeed on all the walls, is inevitably on the figures in the foreground. But let's just look for a moment at this wonderful detail in the background. We've got a cavalcade of horses and camels. Benozzo might never have seen some of these exotic animals, but he was not averse to copying, and he would have copied from books of bestiaries, which were quite common, circulating in Italy at the time. If you look at some of these images here, you can see that his work demonstrates the attention to detail that would be worthy of a goldsmith. Fresco was normally painted on wet plaster, but here Benozzo shows his technical innovation. In the bird's plumage, he used dry plaster and bound the paints together with tempera and oil to capture the luster and detail of the feathers. And if we're looking at detail, just look at this detail of the gory scene of the hawk disemboweling a rabbit. An interesting subject, I think, for a chapel. So the journey is a stunningly beautiful work, full of amazing details. It's simply mesmerizing. But even more, it's actually a work about power and politics. Donald Trump would immediately recognize what this picture's about, and he'd want to be center stage in it. There are Medici emblems and symbolism everywhere. Benozzo even writes the word semper on parts of the picture. And that's Latin for always. And that's the Medici saying, we are three dynasties. We're going to be here forever. We're going to rule forever in Florence. So, what you see in the journey is actually perhaps the first political manifesto in art. It's a message which is loud and clear. We don't just represent Florence, we are Florence. So, like the Magi, the Medici are on a journey. At one level, you can take it as a spiritual journey towards the Virgin and Christ. But more importantly for them, it represented a temporal journey, because by the end of that journey, they would have achieved their divine right to rule. They would be equal to the finest princes in Italy. But sadly, of course, we all know that that was never to be achieved. So we've reached the end of our journey. I hope I've convinced you that this is a masterpiece by an artist deserving far greater recognition than he currently receives. If you're visiting Florence, you can queue for the Uffizi and go down miles and miles of corridors looking at miles of Renaissance masterpieces. Or you can go to the Accademia and you can marvel at Michelangelo's David. But I would encourage you actually to step back in time and to embrace the glory and power of the Medici, which is on show in this wonderful chapel. I guarantee you will not be disappointed. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today.